Hello and welcome to Teachwire Talks, the podcast that knows education is a serious business, but talking about it doesn't always have to be. My name is Helen Mully, and there are few things I enjoy more than chewing over edu topics with people who really know their stuff, which means that essentially hosting Teachwire Talks is my dream job. Because in every episode, I get to chat to real experts from inside and outside classrooms about anything education focused, from pedagogical trends to playground rhymes. The aim is simple, to have intelligent, open, creative discussion, and above all, to make sure that if you, lovely listeners, are giving us your very precious time, you come away with something you can actually use in your practice. So that's the premise. And here is the topic for today's episode. Today on Teachwire Talks, we are going to be digging into STEM education and thinking about a question that might sound slightly strange at first. And it's this: are your pupils smarter than a Stone Age engineer? You see, when we think about STEM, it's generally all pretty future-facing and shiny. It's all coding, robotics, and that tedious idea of preparing children for jobs that don't even exist yet. Don't get me started on that. But what if some of the most impressive examples of STEM thinking actually happened thousands of years ago? Listeners, I would like you now to close your eyes and picture Stonehenge. I know you can. It's one of the most iconic sites in the world. And in this episode, we are going to be exploring how Stonehenge can help us teach everything from measurement and materials to problem solving and systems thinking. And crucially, we'll also be thinking about how we can bring that into the classroom, whether you're standing in front of the stones or nowhere near them. And to do all that, I am thrilled to be joined by two brilliant guests. First, I'd like to welcome Jennifer Wexler, historian at English Heritage, who spends a lot of time thinking about exactly what Stonehenge can teach us, not just about the past, but about how people think, solve problems, and innovate. Hello, Jennifer.
Hello.
It's lovely to have you, Jennifer. And alongside Jennifer, we have Thomas K. Briggs, whom I'm going to call Tom, a former secondary maths teacher and now an education consultant working across the heritage sector. Someone who's particularly passionate about making sure the M in STEM gets the attention it deserves, but doesn't always receive. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks, Helen. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi.
It's so good to have you both. Okay, so before we get properly into the meaty stuff, let's start with a bit of a warm-up. I've got a question for you both, and actually, I think this would make a really good lesson hook, by the way. So, Jennifer, Tom, I want you to imagine this. You have been dropped into the Stone Age. You've got no machines, no metal, no written instructions, but you've been told you have to build something enormous. What's the first thing you'd want to invent or figure out before you even start? And I'm going to come to you first, Jennifer, with that tricky question.
I think ideally you'd want some of our modern technology.
Of course you would.
You'd want a big crane because that would make your life a lot easier. But obviously that technology didn't exist 4,500 years ago, which is when Stonehenge was built. So we had to use much more basic materials to work out. And it is a really tricky question because, how did people build Stonehenge? It is baffling to this day. And I think it is something that draws people to the site, even now, because it's such a unique monument. And it's something that archaeologists are still struggling with and still debating about because we don't have all the information. So it's something that we're trying to work out. And I think it's worth pointing out that, this is a time when people had really basic materials. So, organic things like wood, plant, what for rope, stone.
Yeah.
And that was it, basically.
This is why I think it's such a great lesson hook. Tom, what do you think you'd want to come up with first?
I'm sort of torn between the mathematical principles behind levers, the knowledge of how levers work. I'm sure they used levers back then, but did they really understand how they worked and then how to get the most out of them? Or possibly the pulley. I think the pulley would make a massive difference.
Okay, this is a really good start. So let's dig a little deeper into this and find out some more. I would like us to take a deeper dive into three of the problems that the engineers of Stonehenge simply couldn't have solved without what we would now call STEM thinking, and have a think about how they might have managed it, given what we've already established, that they don't have access to these modern tools and these modern materials. So let's start with the absolute basics, and that is moving those massive stones. Jennifer, what can you tell us about how they moved the stones? What do we know? What misconceptions do people have?
Well, I mean, first, it's worth pointing out that there's multiple different types of stones at Stonehenge that come from different locations. So it's a multi-part question. If you were going to have a mathematics question, it would be multi-part. So we have smaller stones. Those are called blue stones, and they come from the Preseli Hills in southwestern Wales, and that's about 200 kilometers away from Stonehenge. So the distance is really far. Those weigh around 1 to 2 tons each. So the smaller stones, but if you were to multiply that against distance, the amount of effort might have been bigger than the big stones, which are Saracen stones. So the stones that are the famous stones at Stonehenge, the ones that have the kind of lintel, the tops that everyone thinks about, those are Saracens. And they come from much closer to the site. They're about 25 kilometers away, just to the north. And so it's not as far, but some of those are the heaviest is about 40 tons. They're averaging around 30 tons each. So to move all of them, so those are the uprights. The uprights are about 30 tons. The tops are about 10 tons. so the weight of that is amazing. And then we have one other stone at the center of the circle called an altar stone, which we now know, we've just discovered. And actually, science has been so important to this discovery because they've used scientific techniques to study the mineral composition and figure out where it came from. And that's called the altar stone. And it comes from northeast Scotland, about 450 kilometers away. And that's about 6 tons. So it's a bit mind-blowing.
It is hugely mind-blowing. So what evidence do we have, if any, about how those stones were moved? Are we just hypothesizing?
We are mostly hypothesizing. And actually, there's been a number of archaeological experiments around how to move the stones, how many people it would take, how long it would take, all of that. So I do have a few stats, but this is not, I should say there's not sort of one 100% agreed, because they're all theories. But, it would have been up to sort of 3.7 million people hours overall to build the circle. So that's a lot. So for the smaller stones, the blue stones I mentioned that come from Wales, they've done some experiments. And actually, we think that they're probably, the most likely thing is they're putting them on essentially sledges, on wooden sledges that you could drag. So you're not kind of physically carrying it, in your arms. There would be a team of people. Some people have asked, have debated about if there was some kind of animal, like an oxen being used because they were around at that time. But we still don't have a lot of evidence for that. So the most likely evidence is people were dragging the stones. And actually, some of the experiments show for 1 to 2 tons, you might only need about 15 people if you have the right setup, which isn't too bad if you think about it. But having said that, coming all the way from Wales is a long, long way. So you have to imagine that this would have been a massive community effort. And, to move something like that would have been a real event as they moved stones through different communities. And we think it's more likely now that they probably did overground movement rather than the boat sort of sea-based movement, just because you wouldn't want to risk losing your stone. These would have been really important. They probably had spiritual importance. They came from important places. They were rare objects. And every time they've done a boat experiment, they've sunk. They had boats, but they were fairly simple boats. They were quite basic. So, but a lot more work has been done on moving the big Saracens, the really big 30-ton stones. And there we are thinking that, again, they're using some kind of sledge, but most likely possibly building a trackway for part of the way. Because they move so many stones, there's just over 80. You need maybe something you could use over and over again and really have a system in place to kind of get it. And that would make it a lot easier. And probably they're following the roots of the river. The River Avon is the river that goes to that area, because you would get a lower, flatter sort of route you could follow, which makes sense. And so we think that part of it might have been trackways. Some people think rollers is another option. Some of this is inspired by research done in communities that historically, I'm talking about, 100, 200 years ago, we're still moving big stones in other parts of the world and the ways they went about it. So that kind of gives a little bit of inspiration. But also with the experiments, it makes sense. But there's so much effort because actually, when you think about everyone thinks about the stone, but the amount of wood you would have needed to build a trackway, to build, a sledge or a cradle for the stone, and to probably have poles to kind of nudge it along and help it move. And then there's a lot of physics elements, like if you're going uphill or downhill, friction's a big thing. So some people have suggested, maybe they slid it when it was on an icy, during the winter. But again, there's not a lot of evidence. So they think they used some other materials as well.
Whoa, it's such a huge undertaking. Tom, I'm going to bring you in at this point, and I'm going to ask you to bring a classroom perspective here, because I'm not a teacher, but I am feeling an excitement about this as a learning opportunity. I'm imagining myself in a classroom being faced with this as an issue. You've got no modern tools, you've got no modern materials. You have to move these enormous stones, these ridiculously long distances. What are you thinking, Tom, about how this might translate into a classroom activity?
So what I've got in my mind at the moment is having visited Stonehenge in the past. I'm a Stonehenge fan. I'm wearing my Stonehenge hoodie right now. And I've been a few times. I remember outside the visitor centre, there's a mock-up of a stone on rollers, and it's got a rope hanging off the front of it, and you can go and pick up the rope and tug on the rope and try and pull the stone. Of course, it doesn't move, but there's a little digital display that tells you how many of you pulling at that particular level would be required to make it budge. And I've always thought that from that one simple idea, there are opportunities for science and mathematics investigation across the school curriculum, from primary school all the way up to A-level. So, for example, just the opportunities there's this little digital display saying how many of me I need to be able to pull this rock, but just digging in a little deeper and thinking about how that's worked out. How do we know that? And if we understand how things like that can be worked out, then we can start to expand the question. Like, what if we have to drag it up a hill? Or what if we have to get it down a hill? How does the problem change? How many people do we need then? How many locals do we have to pay off to help us out? And things like that. What's the danger if it suddenly starts to slide under its own gravity? It's under its own weight down the hill. How fast is it going to go? What speed might it get up to? Things like that. Just sort of, I feel that using mathematics in particular is a great way of understanding the problems that would have faced the Stone Age people doing these things for whatever reason they were doing them.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I love about how this conversation is going, that already we've got those three elements coming into the learning. We've got the mathematics and the science. We've got the real world application, because everyone can picture Stonehenge even if they haven't actually been there. Obviously, being there is the ideal, because then you get that sense of scale, but everyone can picture it. And then you've got imagination as well. I was getting so excited at the idea of those conversations. I can hear them with the young people and the things they would come up with about the things that might go wrong and how you could deal with them. And all the time you're learning really important fundamental principles. It's kind of got everything, hasn't it? What do you think, Jennifer?
No, definitely. And actually we've had some great education sessions at Stonehenge, which we do regularly, where we ask young people to come up with some solutions and trial things out. And we have all sorts of models and things that you can go, because it is a real idea, imagination that you need to kind of, think about. I mean, the pulling stone, I'm glad you enjoyed that, Tom, because it is really amazing. And Basically, I mean, the thing I would say to kids is that the process they're going through of trying to work it out is the same process that archaeologists have been going through for probably at least 100 years, if not longer, to try to work it out, because unfortunately, we don't have that written record of how people did it. So we can only do it through experimenting and thinking about things like maths and engineering and physics. And so all the information we have is based on this experimental kind of project. And actually, I should say, with the amount of people, one of the experiments showed that it would, for a 30 to 40 ton stone, it'd probably take about 200 people, possibly up to 12 days to get it from the quarry site to Stonehenge. It might be a little bit faster with the trackway. These are massive endeavors to think about. And I think, there's such a history in some ways. This period of time, which is the Neolithic, it's the start of farming, it's the start of kind of more settled culture, is really important because it's the first time we're building these types of architectural wonders. But we continue to do this. I think the equivalent of, someplace like Salisbury Cathedral, where, people are still using very simple tools to engineer these mind-blowing structures, So I think it's a great thing to think about on lots of levels.
Absolutely. And the cathedral at Köln as well, which is just phenomenal. And they've been building it for hundreds and hundreds of years. Okay, this is all starting to get very exciting. I would like us to move on to a second challenge that our Stone Age engineers might have faced. And perhaps we can think a little bit about how they would have tackled it and then how it would apply to our modern STEM thinking. And that's this. It's a challenge where I think everyone from movie makers to historians to scientists to teachers to visitors, this is where everyone gets properly captivated and intrigued. And I'm not quite sure how you're going to respond to this, Jennifer, as an archaeologist, but are the stones really positioned with this almost mystical accuracy that we just cannot understand how or even why it was done? Jennifer, is that so, or is that just us being romantic?
Oh no, they definitely are.
Excellent. Good. I'm so glad you said that.
They definitely are. So they are arranged around a central, what we call sun axis, and that's pretty well established. So the stones mark both the shortest and the longest day of the year, the summer and winter solstice. So at the winter solstice, the sun sets that night of the shortest kind of night, just behind the tallest, what we call trilithons, which is 3 upstanding stones at the center of the circle. And then summer, you get the opposite, where it rises above this triangular shaped stone called the heel stone just outside the circle. So we know that there was religious beliefs around the sun and the importance of the sun, and we have a number of monuments aligned to the sun at this period of time. But Stonehenge is probably the most famous one.
Okay, this is definitely the mind-blowing bit for me. Tom, what do you think are the classroom realities of this? How do you think this fits into any kind of a STEM curriculum?
I feel like there's something to be said for exploring motivations and cultural impact of science and mathematics on history. And in some cases it's relatively easy to do that because you've got records and you can match up what people were doing in the past and how they explicitly talk about maths and science. In this case, I think there's a certain amount of, we can never know the truth of what these people were doing and what they were trying to do, but we can make certain guesses, some educated guesses. They're not pure guesses, obviously. They're educated guesses. And think about why people were doing these things. And to my mind, it seems that you can't get these stones in the right place through trial and error. You can't just sort of drag one of those big stones one of the smaller stones from Wales, which is still quite big. You can't just drag it for weeks and weeks and then plonk it in a place and go, oh no, it needs to be moved 3 feet to the left. You've got to know where it's going. You've got to have a plan. And to have a plan that works as well as it obviously did, you need to understand the mathematics behind a number of things, not least the geometry of the solar system. You've got to be able to predict how the sun moves across the horizon and how it pops up at different locations over the course of the year and how that moves and progresses. And you've got to understand the geometry of circles and angles and things like that, because this is a situation where you can't just guess and hope, because if you do that, it's not going to be right. And you have to do that enormous job multiple times before you finally settle on the right place. And
Yeah.
I think this is something that could possibly help to answer that question of why are we learning this before it's even asked? Because it's this question that that I've been asked in the classroom a lot is, when am I ever going to need this? Why are we learning this? And and I think one of the worst things teachers do is try to answer that question when it's asked at that moment, because when it's asked in the classroom, it's almost always, in my experience, a rhetorical question by that point, which means I don't want to do this, I'm bored. And if you can preempt that question and make it so that it's never asked by introducing these discussions and this context, often from history, then I think we can have a much richer experience in mathematics classrooms and science classrooms in general.
I think that is absolutely true. And I think in this part of the conversation, we've got to something really, really important about this link between Stonehenge, STEM thinking, and history, and right across the curriculum, which is about the why of science. Jennifer, is there something you wanted to bring in at this point?
Yeah, I just some of the points that Tom mentioned I think are really important, which is that Stonehenge is unique as a stone circle because it's completely engineered. And so it's engineered to fit together, and it fits together like Lego pieces. So the amount of planning that would have had to go on to get stones fitting together, I mean, the engineering, the geometry, I mean, a lot of maths would have been involved. And it's on a slope too. So you'd have to even out those stones to make sure they would kind of fit up.
Yeah. Tom, was there something you wanted to say?
Yeah, as a teacher of 20 years or so experience, something that I've been repeatedly told is that I have to show students where the maths connects with real life. And I want to highlight the fact that that's always been painted as my responsibility as a teacher. I have to introduce the context for the students. And I've always felt a little bit uncomfortable with that because I'm an expert in maths and teaching maths, but I'm not an expert in everything, every situation where maths is used out in the real world. And I can introduce context, but sometimes it does feel a little bit contrived. Whereas if the context comes knocking on the classroom door from outside, then it's that much more real. When we've got experts like Jennifer on behalf of Stonehenge is doing this work to show where the fascinating story links up with the STEM classroom, with STEM classrooms, then the students in those classrooms are like, this is not Mr. Briggs again telling us that this matches up with something that we have no relationship with. This is an expert from outside going, no, actually, there's a distinct link between the maths that you're doing and what went on in some interesting part of history. And I think that handshake is something that really needs to happen, rather than teachers being told to make it relevant. I think if the relevance comes from outside into the classroom rather than being just spoken about by teachers, I think that just makes it that much more real and exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Jennifer, I can see you nodding.
Yes, well, actually, and I was thinking, because I am not a mathematician at all, but I mean, a question really for Tom, because one thing that actually, again, with thinking about kind of lesson plans and how you engage children around the ideas of constructing someplace like Stonehenge, one thing like archaeologists have really debated about is if there is this kind of standardized measurements, going back to the Neolithic. And we have some hints here and there. We've got, they have found measuring rods, not in England, but in Ireland, Germany, Denmark. So, a sense of maybe some kind of standardized. And certain people have kind of proposed different measurements over time. So like one of it is called a long foot. And it kind of has that idea of, you have a center point that you're measuring off of in a standardized way, and using the kind of classic things we would probably use, like our feet, our hands, that traditional methods. There was another very popular theory called the megalithic yard. And a lot of people have tried to measure things against this. And again, it's kind of that, it's a sort of almost like a yardstick. And they've only found that it works for some circles. So I think that would be something interesting to think about from a mathematics mathematics perspective, like how would a mathematician, because archaeologists are trying to use math, but maybe we're not like the experts, like think about like kind of units of measure and measuring possibilities, with students.
What do you think, Tom?
This is a topic that stretches across the school, across school from, again, primary school all the way up to sixth form and beyond. The units of measurement we use are massively important, but trying to get students to use them alongside the numbers is often a little bit tricky, to get them to see the relevance of this. And I think the root of this is about communication, isn't it? It's about communicating what we're doing. Like, how far away is such and such? If you just say 10, what's that? 10 centimeters, 10 feet, 10 miles, 10 parsecs, what the very different answers. The units of measurement are absolutely core.
Yeah, absolutely. And this kind of brings us on to the third challenge that I wanted us to talk about. I suppose it's more the human side of STEM, although I don't want to suggest that the rest of STEM is not human connected, because of course it is. It's all about how humans think and work. And Jennifer, you've touched on this a bit already, but a project like this would have required incredible planning, organisation, and critically, communication. They did all need to know that they were dealing with the same units of measurements. They were talking about the same stones. They were talking about the same solar system, everything. So, Jennifer, what, if anything, do we know about the project management behind this?
Again, unfortunately, we don't have that written record to kind of tell us exactly, but we know just by the skills to put it together that there would have been a lot of engineering skills there. And I think something that I always try to point out to people, because it's sometimes hard to think about thousands of years in the past, is that these were modern humans. They have the same brains as us. They have the same capacity to discover things and to challenge themselves as we do. And at the time of Stonehenge, people are building large stone monuments across the world. At the same time, they're building the pyramids in Egypt, and lots of places are building these grand monuments. And, very different places, very different cultures. But, something's going on which is inspiring people to do this. So you had to imagine they would have to be so organized. And as I said before, like the minimum estimate of people involved in the project of building Stonehenge would be 200 people. It'd probably be a lot more. And the minimum amount of time, if they're really going at it quickly, would be probably 2 to 3 years to get all the stones there, to shape them, to get them up. So it was either a very intense project that happened, over an intense period of time, or it could have been something that was happening more over a decade or so. But I think there probably was a shared belief system around what was going on. It was a response also maybe socially to things happening. Archaeologically, it's right at the edge of a transition where we start to get new people coming from Europe with metalworking technology. So perhaps there was social threats kind of happening even, as well as religious beliefs, that people felt like they needed to do these grand building projects. And it's not just at Stonehenge. It's all over Britain. We're getting this. If you go not far from Stonehenge, Avebury is another site. The stones are different because they're not engineered to fit together, but still they're massively big, and you get, all sorts of things. So something would have had to be organized. And I think sometimes the way archaeologists think about it is the process of building something might have been the most important part rather than the final product, because that's what creates the social cohesion. That's what brings people together.
Right. Again, it's back to the why, isn't it? Everyone must have wanted this thing to happen. And if you try and scale that up into the modern world with all our modern communication, the equivalent would be, I don't know, the entire population of the United Kingdom working together on one project.
It wouldn't have been quite, even though the population levels were much lower than today, it wouldn't have been the whole population. But if you think about across all of Britain, there's a number of these sites, all the way going up to Scotland. There's some really impressive sites, in the north of England and Scotland and Ireland. So this kind of religious belief, and also possibly kind of an artistic, because it's also really a time we see kind of artistic outpourings happening too. There is some conversation happening across the British Isles at this time, which is inspiring people to make these sites. And, some of it is really, it is pretty cosmic. It's really kind of connecting and controlling to the power of the sun. So you're connecting up the earth, the stones, the underworld with the sky. That's pretty cosmic stuff. But I think it's also worth mentioning that, they had quite a lot of experience because they were doing stuff like this on lots of scales for going back a couple thousand years. We have earlier things like tombs, like long barrows that were the first architecture. So, places where people buried. We also know that they're going to places to get stone materials to make tools that are sometimes really out of the way, like the top of the Lake District, the highest mountain in the Lake District. So in some ways, they have a lot of experience of going and getting materials and manipulating materials. It's just that this is on a much bigger scale.
Right. So, Tom, do you think it's important to bring this element of project management and planning and purpose into learning around STEM? Or do you think that risks just spiraling people off into an existential crisis?
No, I think it's really important because within all that stuff, the planning and the motivations for doing things is the motivations for doing the science and for doing the maths, and not just the doing of maths and science, but the learning of it. And when I say learning, I don't mean necessarily individuals learning off other individuals, students learning from teachers. I mean people striving to improve understanding of these things as a society or as a culture. So learning mathematics that is new to a particular set of individuals and learning that together. And some of what's come up in terms of like the religious motivations and other cultural motivations for building things like Stonehenge reminded me that throughout history, a lot of the motivations for developing understanding of mathematics more broadly was motivated by religion and a need to understand the world a bit better. So a lot of the early mathematics done in ancient India, for example, was about understanding the universe and the gods and what they wanted and what they needed, and understanding that more means understanding how the stars and planets are moving with relation to us, and so on.
Yeah, Jennifer.
I think that's such a great, interesting and important point because I think it is very easy to go down the mystery, baffling, how do they do this or why? But something like the alignments, solstice alignments, actually they're observing something that's important to them. They're trying to understand. And, these observations we know are going on for thousands of years, And so even though it seems baffling to us, it's something that's important to these people. And Stonehenge is a great example because Stonehenge is a really wide open landscape. You've got big horizons. So it's really easy in a way to stick something like a stick or a pole or a stone in a position and then watch, how the sun moves or the moon moves or, and make those observations. So you really do get the sense that people are watching the sky and it's connected to mythology and religion, but there is this kind of maybe wonder and awe and thirst for knowledge as well.
Wonder and awe, that's wonderful. And that is what learning should all be about, isn't it? And that brings us on to one last thing I want us to think about is that something that teachers often worry about when it comes to STEM is that pupils tend to divide themselves off into STEM people and non-STEM people. And that might be along gender lines or it might be along interest lines or whatever. But for some reason, they get to a certain point, possibly even before they've even finished primary school, and they've decided that, they're not really a STEM person. They're more an English kind of a person. And it seems to me that this conversation has had such a strong narrative running through it, so many potentials, that it gets to the heart of that side of STEM that doesn't always get talked about, which is that idea that science is not a fixed body of knowledge that we are simply passing on from generation to generation. It's a continuum. It's a constant learning and evolving. And all of those things that were driving those Stone Age engineers to learn and understand and make things that's still happening just with all the accumulated knowledge we've had over the years. And it seems to me that Stonehenge is such a tangible way of explaining that to pupils. Jennifer, do you think that that is the kind of real world learning that Stonehenge can bring?
Definitely. And I think it should be inspirational in the sense of, people did have really basic materials, but they still built something amazing. And that inbuilt, ability that humans have. I often get a little bit annoyed when people kind of say, oh, it had to be aliens, right? Because I'm like, because that undermines the abilities of humans. Like, humans have been building amazing things for thousands of years, and not just here, across the world, everywhere in the world, they're doing these wonders. And now we're so used to all our modern conveniences. We're used to our watches, now on our phones, on our hands, whatever. We forget to look up at the sky. We don't read the stars. We don't read the sun in the same way. But people then did. And so actually, in some ways, I think something that's really inspirational and something that is drawing a lot of people back to a lot of these sites is that people did have that really deep connection to nature and to the world. And they could read their world in a way that we've kind of lost. And I think that's something that is really good to kind of talk to students about, because we have this disconnection with technology that we don't engage in this hands-on way. I mean, what's really interesting at the moment is we're building a new massive Neolithic hall. And this is part of our development of our new education program, which is connected to STEM learning. But we have all these volunteers on site. And it's like, that's so fascinating. They're using these kind of old, 4,000-year-old building techniques to build a Neolithic house.
You're doing it without modern tools.
They're doing very minimal modern tools. It is primarily using, ancient techniques. And so part of that is experimental to learn how they would go about building a building like this just based on an archaeological plan, something that was excavated. So it is experimental, but also the satisfaction of doing something with your hands and your mind and trying to work it out, and really basic, like, oh, we don't have a measuring tape, but like we can have a rope and use that, as a measuring tool based on, the length of my arm or whatever. To use all those kind of techniques and knowledge is actually really satisfying. It's really much more of a hands-on approach to the world, which I think is lovely.
Yeah, definitely. Tom, do you think something like Stonehenge is a way of tackling this? Well, I'm not a STEM person, or even, I can't do maths.
I think it's one of many, many things that we could be doing. And in the heritage sector, working as a maths educator, I hear a particular phrase more often than I'm happy with, and that is, I'm not a mathsy person because I'm creative. And how creative is it to lock yourself off from an entire branch of human discovery? The earliest mathematical artifacts that have been discovered are about 40,000 years old, which is 8 times older than the earliest examples of writing. Mathematics has been a creative discipline that humans have been pushed to study and improve themselves in for the whole of human history, arguably. And I think it's a shame that modern society tends to separate itself into maths people and science people and creative and humanities people. There's a divide between the two. It's very much a divide in society rather than a divide specifically in classrooms. Teachers have the responsibility loaded on them to change that and show children that they can be both types of people in one. But I don't think it's schools that are teaching them that. It's society in general. We have a bad attitude to maths, especially maths, but also science.
Okay, so I think for me, this episode it's been a bit of a journey of discovery for me as well. I was looking forward to a chat about Stonehenge. I was looking forward to learning a bit more, and also about seeing how it might translate into classroom activities. But I feel like we've tapped into something much more profound than that. We've tapped into something about human beings and their relationship with science and with maths and with creativity and with storytelling and with themselves. And it's all wrapped up in this incredible monument, Stonehenge, that is there within traveling distance for all of us. And we can actually go and see it and soak up what it has to offer, which I just think, as an educational resource, as well as a resource for humans generally, is so exciting and powerful. And incredibly, we are nearly out of time for this episode. But before we wrap up, I do have one final question for both of you. And it's the one we started with. I'm going to wheel us back to that. And I'm going to say that Jennifer and Tom, if you ask a student, are you smarter than a Stone Age engineer? And they come back with, of course I am. What would you say to them? And Tom, I'm going to come to you first.
Thanks very much. I mean, I kind of liken this to the idea that teachers are necessarily smarter than their students. And I think that's not true. I think the students that I've taught throughout my career have been just as smart as I am, and a lot of them much smarter than I am, and will go on to do more difficult things than I will ever do. And some of them have already achieved that. And I think it's not about being smart. It's not about being more intelligent. It's about being more experienced. So nowadays, the students that we work with are so much more experienced than their counterparts in Stonehenge's time.
That makes sense. Jennifer, what do you think?
I think they're probably not smarter because we have such a disconnect, as I was saying before, with kind of technology. So you would really have to put your mind back, to that time and think about the materials they would have had at that time, to think about, how they would go about doing something, but why they would be doing it as well. In a sense, it's kind of crazy. It's kind of crazy to be building Stonehenge and all these other big monuments. You also we don't have that, the feeling behind it that people then that would have really spurred you on to be doing this sort of thing. So I don't think it's necessarily about if you're smarter or not, because I think probably with any clever student could probably sit down, and work out some ideas around how you would have gone about building Stonehenge, but it's maybe just the kind of cultural or social context is very different. So, but it's important to do these exercises to get back in. I think it's really important to think about a different time, a different place, a different way of doing something, a different way of living, and that's something that I also really love about archaeology and just talking about these kind of things.
Absolutely. And what a brilliant spark for learning as well. What a brilliant challenge to get students fired up and excited. That is so brilliant. And also, sadly, it's all we have time for. I would like to say a huge thank you to Jennifer Wexler from English Heritage, and to Thomas K. Briggs for joining us today. It's been properly inspiring to think about how some of the greatest STEM thinking happened thousands of years before we started reading about it in our textbooks. And to our listeners, if today's conversation has inspired you, which I really hope it has, make sure you sign up to get all the latest news and updates from English Heritage for Learners at Stonehenge. Along with incredible resources and school trip experiences, you can bring real-world problem solving to life for your students. You'll find everything you need at english-heritage.org.uk/inspiring the future. Don't worry, all of those details are in the episode notes. And until next time, keep asking the big questions, because that's what great STEM teaching and Teach Why Talks are all about.